Whatever happens in that room, Daniel, do not speak unless someone asks you directly. Lauren said it without looking at me, her eyes fixed on her reflection in the dark glass beside the elevator doors as she adjusted the collar of her navy blazer. We were 43 floors above Manhattan, surrounded by polished stone, brushed steel, and the kind of silence expensive buildings seem to manufacture on purpose. I watched her smooth one loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear, then check her phone again. 8:47 a.m., 13 minutes before the merger meeting that had consumed nearly 2 years of her life. I'm serious, she added. This is not one of those dinners where you can make conversation with whoever happens to sit beside you. There are board members in there, attorneys, investment bankers, people who have spent months negotiating every line of this deal. I looked at the black leather folder tucked beneath my arm. Understood. That answer seemed to relax her. She finally looked at me and gave me the small professional smile she had started using at home without realizing it. The same smile she gave hotel staff, junior analysts, and people whose names she planned to forget 5 minutes later. Thank you. Today matters. I almost smiled at that. She had no idea how much. The elevator chimed, and the doors opened onto the executive conference floor of the Whitmore Grand. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the lobby, turning lower Manhattan into a wall of glass and sunlight. Assistants moved quietly between conference rooms carrying binders and coffee trays. Men and women in dark suits stood in small circles speaking in lowered voices. Halcyon Systems on one side, Westbridge Technologies on the other. Two companies worth billions of dollars preparing to become one before lunch. Lauren stepped out first. I followed half a pace behind her. That was how most people there saw us anyway. Lauren Mercer, Senior Vice President of Corporate Strategy at Halcyon Systems, and Daniel Mercer, her husband, the guest, the spouse, the man who had apparently come along because someone had added a +1 line to the schedule. Lauren, Thomas Reed, crossed the lobby. Toward us, his hand already extended. Halcyon CEO was 55, silver-haired, perfectly tailored, and permanently surrounded by the quiet confidence of a man who had spent 20 years entering rooms where everyone already knew his title. Big morning. The biggest, Lauren said. Thomas shook her hand, then turned toward me. His smile changed just slightly. Warmer. Simpler. The smile executives reserve for someone they believe has nothing to do with the reason they are there. Daniel, good to see you again. Thomas. He glanced at my folder. Lauren dragging you into the corporate circus today? Lauren laughed before I could answer. He promised to behave. Thomas chuckled. Smart man. Then he leaned a little closer and nodded toward the conference room. Trust me, Daniel, once the bankers start talking about integration models, you'll wish you'd stayed downstairs with the good coffee. Maybe, I said. He gave my shoulder a friendly pat and walked away. Lauren exhaled through her nose. See? That's exactly what I mean. Just let them do their thing. Their thing. I looked through the glass wall into the boardroom. A long walnut table ran nearly 30 feet from one end to the other. Leather chairs, water glasses, printed briefing books arranged with military precision. Small brass nameplates marked every seat. Reed, Whitmore, Grant, Foster, Chun, Caldwell. Names that had appeared in financial newspapers, regulatory filings, and quarterly reports for years. Lauren moved toward the entrance, but I slowed for half a second. There was one chair near the center of the table with no nameplate in front of it. Just a black folder identical to the one beneath my arm and a silver pen placed carefully across the top. Someone inside noticed me. Margaret Whitmore, CEO of Westbridge Technologies, stopped speaking to one of her directors and met my eyes through the glass. She didn't smile. She simply gave me one small nod. Respectful. Deliberate. Lauren missed it completely. Her phone buzzed again, and she was already answering a message. Come on, she said. They're seating everyone. We stepped inside. Conversations continued around us, but something subtle changed. Michael Grant, a corporate attorney I had known for 17 years, looked up from his papers. He started to stand. I gave him the smallest shake of my head. He understood and stayed seated. Lauren touched my sleeve and pointed toward a chair against the wall behind the main table. You can sit there. It should only be a few hours. I looked at the chair, then at her. For 16 years, I had believed there was a difference between keeping your life private and allowing someone to misunderstand it. Standing there that morning, I realized how thin that difference had become. All right, I said. Lauren smiled, relieved, and took her place at the table. I sat quietly behind her, exactly where she wanted me, while two boards prepared to decide the future of their companies. What Lauren didn't know was that before either company could change hands, before a single announcement could go public, before anyone in that room could celebrate, there was one decision they still needed. Mine. From the chair behind Lauren, I had a clear view of the entire table, and for the first 20 minutes, nobody treated me like anything more than furniture. That was fine. I had spent years learning that people reveal more when they believe the quietest man in the room has no influence over them. Thomas Reed opened the meeting with the polished confidence of someone who had repeated the same speech in front of a mirror. He talked about shared vision, expanded markets, stronger margins, and a future that would make both companies more competitive. Lauren sat 3 seats to his right, posture straight, expression composed, every page in her briefing bookmarked with colored tabs. She had prepared for this morning like an athlete preparing for a championship game. I knew because I had watched her do it. For 6 months, our dining room table had disappeared beneath printed reports, legal summaries, spreadsheets, and handwritten notes. Most nights, she came to bed after midnight. Most mornings, she was awake before the coffee finished brewing. I had respected the work. I had admired it, even when she stopped noticing that I was awake too. Thomas handed the discussion to an investment banker, named Andrew Collins, who began walking everyone through valuation assumptions. Numbers appeared on the screen at the far end of the room. Revenue projections, cost reductions, integration expenses, 5-year forecasts. Lauren followed every slide like she already knew what was coming. She probably did. I watched the numbers instead. One projection caught my attention immediately. Westbridge operating growth, year 3, 11.8%. My eyes stayed on it for a second longer than they should have. Michael Grant noticed. He did not turn toward me, but his pen stopped moving. Andrew continued talking. Nobody else reacted. I leaned back and said nothing. Lauren glanced over her shoulder once, saw me sitting quietly, and seemed satisfied. The presentation moved on. 10 minutes later, another figure appeared. A liability reserve that was lower than the number I had seen in a private due diligence report 3 weeks earlier. Not dramatically lower, just enough to look harmless unless you knew where to look. I felt something tighten beneath my ribs. Not alarm. Recognition. Good deals rarely fall apart because of one enormous lie. They weaken through small numbers placed where tired people will not question them. Andrew clicked to the next slide before I could study the figure longer. Across the table, Margaret Whitmore folded her hands. She had seen it too. I could tell by the way her eyes shifted toward Thomas instead of the screen. Lauren did not notice. She was already preparing to speak. When Thomas invited her to explain the integration strategy, her entire presence changed. Her voice sharpened. Her shoulders settled. This was the Lauren I remembered from years ago, the woman who could enter a room full of skeptical people and make them listen. She explained how the companies would combine sales teams, consolidate offices, and preserve the strongest parts of each culture. She spoke without hesitation. No filler. No wasted words. For a few minutes, I forgot the distance that had grown between us. I simply watched my wife do something she was very good at. When she finished, several directors nodded. Thomas smiled like a man watching an investment pay off. That, he said, is why Lauren has been essential to this deal. A small wave of approval moved around the table. Lauren allowed herself a restrained smile. Then Thomas looked past her and caught my eye. You must be proud. Every face near him turned toward me. Lauren stiffened almost imperceptibly. I could have answered honestly. I could have said yes. I could have told them I knew exactly how many nights she had worked, how many weekends she had sacrificed, how many times dinner went cold while she remained on a conference call. Instead, I remembered the hallway. Do not speak unless someone asks you directly. Thomas had asked. So I said, I am. 2 words. Nothing more. A few people smiled. Lauren relaxed. Thomas chuckled. A man of few words. I respect that. Then he turned back to the presentation, and the room forgot me again. That was when I noticed something else. The empty chair near the center of the table was still untouched. No one had moved the black folder. No one had taken the silver pen. It was being saved. For me. Yet everyone around Lauren seemed determined to believe I belonged against the wall. I wondered when she had started believing it too. There had been a time when she asked my opinion on everything. Apartment leases, job offers, investments, even which route to take on a road trip. Somewhere between promotions, conferences, and years of carefully separated work lives, she had stopped asking. I had told myself it was independence. Maybe it was distance. The presentation continued, but I was no longer listening only as a husband. I was listening as the man whose approval would eventually be requested, and the numbers were beginning to tell a story I did not like. Then Andrew brought up the next slide, and Michael finally looked directly at me. It lasted less than a second. That was enough. He had seen it too. The next slide should have been routine, but the room changed the moment it appeared. A projected 12-month integration schedule filled the screen, broken into clean blue bars and neat quarterly targets. Andrew Collins continued speaking, explaining how overlapping departments would be combined, how regional offices would be consolidated, and how nearly $180 million in annual savings would be achieved by the end of the second year. Lauren leaned forward slightly. This was her section. I knew it before Thomas said her name. Lauren, walk us through the execution plan. She stood without looking at me, gathered a thin stack of notes, and moved toward the screen. There was no hesitation in her steps, no nervous adjustment of her jacket, no searching for words. This was the moment she had been building toward for 2 years. The strategy is simple, she began. We preserve what each company does best and remove duplication without damaging the teams that created the value in the first place. Her voice carried across the room with measured confidence. She explained regional restructuring, customer retention, software migration, and leadership assignments with the precision of someone who had lived inside the numbers for months. Directors interrupted with questions. She answered every one. Margaret Whitmore challenged a timeline involving 3 Westbridge offices on the East Coast. Lauren did not become defensive. She opened a supporting page, cited the staffing data, and explained why the transition could be completed within 9 months instead of 12. Margaret considered it, then nodded. Thomas looked pleased. I could almost see what he saw when he looked at my wife. Not Lauren Mercer, the woman who drank coffee barefoot at our kitchen island on Sunday mornings. Not the woman who used to fall asleep beside me with a paperback open against her chest. He saw an executive ready for a larger title. Maybe she saw the same thing when she looked in the mirror now. I had heard enough private conversations over the past year to know what was at stake for her. Nobody had officially promised anything, but the expectation was clear. If the merger closed successfully, Halcyon would reorganize its senior leadership. Thomas intended to create a new chief strategy officer position. Lauren was the obvious candidate. The salary would rise. The stock package would be substantial. More important to her, the title would put her one step from the executive committee she had spent years trying to reach. She had never told me outright that she needed this deal. She did not have to. I had watched her build her entire calendar around it. Christmas dinner had been interrupted by a call from London. Our anniversary reservation had been moved twice because negotiations changed. On Memorial Day weekend, while neighbors grilled burgers and children rode bicycles down our street, Lauren spent 7 hours in my home office reviewing integration models. I never complained. Ambition was not what troubled me. I had been ambitious once, maybe more than she knew. What bothered me was the way ambition had slowly changed the temperature of our marriage. Work used to be something we discussed. Then it became something she explained. Eventually, it became something she assumed I would not understand. Daniel is happier staying out of all this corporate nonsense, she had told friends at dinner a few months earlier. Everyone laughed. I had smiled. It was easier than explaining that several companies represented in that restaurant had once asked me for capital. Lauren continued her presentation, and I found myself genuinely proud of her. That was the difficult part. Resentment would have been simpler. She was talented. She had earned the respect in that room. She had spent years proving herself in an industry where confidence was often mistaken for competence, and she had become too experienced to confuse the two. When she finished, Thomas folded his hands on the table. Excellent. That is the level of preparation that got us here. Several directors murmured agreement. Lauren returned to her seat, and for the first time that morning, she looked back at me with something warmer than caution. I gave her a small nod. Her expression softened for half a second. Then Thomas leaned toward her and said quietly, though not quietly enough, "Get this across the finish line today, and we can start talking seriously about what comes next for you." Lauren tried to hide her reaction. She almost succeeded. Her fingers tightened around her pen. A small breath left her. Thank you, Thomas. There it was. The future she wanted, sitting only a few signatures away. I looked toward the screen again. $180 million in projected savings. 11.8% operating growth. A liability reserve that did not match the independent report on my desk at home. The numbers were too clean. The future in that presentation looked almost perfect. Perfect was a word I had learned to distrust. Michael turned one page in his folder and placed his index finger beside a line of text. He did not look at me this time. He did not need to. I knew exactly which number he was marking. Lauren believed this meeting was about proving she belonged at the next level. Thomas believed it was about closing the largest transaction of his career. The bankers believed it was about fees. The directors believed it was about shareholder value. Sitting against the wall, silent exactly as my wife had requested, I was beginning to understand that before the morning ended, all of them might discover they were in a very different meeting. There had been a time when Lauren would have laughed at the idea that I did not belong in a room like that. 18 years earlier, before Halcyon Systems knew her name, and before anyone called me retired, she had watched me build a company from a rented 1,200-square-foot warehouse outside Newark with 6 employees, 3 folding tables, and a coffee maker that worked only when someone kicked the cabinet beneath it. I was 30 then, stubborn enough to believe exhaustion was a business strategy. Our software handled industrial logistics, the invisible systems that kept warehouses moving and manufacturers from losing millions of dollars when equipment, inventory, and shipping schedules stopped communicating with each other. It was not glamorous. There were no magazine covers waiting for me. Most days smelled like dust, overheated electronics, and takeout coffee. Lauren was finishing graduate school at the time. She would come by after class carrying sandwiches and sit on an overturned shipping crate while I explained problems she had never asked to understand. She listened anyway. That was what I remembered most. She listened. When I told her one regional distributor might sign our first major contract, she asked what would happen if they did. When I told her I was thinking about hiring 8 more engineers before we had enough cash to comfortably cover payroll, she asked whether I believed the risk was worth it. She never pretended to know more than she did, and I never made her feel small for asking. We were partners before we had anything worth fighting over. 3 years later, the warehouse was gone. We had offices in New Jersey, Chicago, Dallas, and San Jose. 6 employees became nearly 400. Revenue crossed $100 million, then kept climbing. The newspapers called me a young technology founder. Investors called me aggressive. Competitors called me lucky. Lauren called me Daniel. That mattered more than I admitted. She was beside me when the company nearly lost its largest customer. She was beside me when we landed the contract that saved us. She sat in hotel rooms while I took midnight calls from California, and I sat in the back row when she received her first major promotion. We did not keep score. At least I did not think we did. The biggest change came when a public technology group offered to acquire the operating company. The number was large enough to make everyone around me speak faster. Lawyers arrived. Bankers arrived. People who had ignored my calls 5 years earlier suddenly wanted lunch. I accepted the deal, but I kept a meaningful portion of my capital invested through a holding structure Michael Grant helped me build. I was 36 years old, and, for the first time since college, nobody needed me at an office before sunrise. Lauren expected me to start another company immediately. So did everyone else. I did not. I had spent years building something visible. I wanted to learn how to build quietly. I began investing in companies most people had never heard of, businesses with good products, weak balance sheets, and leadership teams that needed patient capital more than publicity. Michael and I created Mercer Ridge Holdings. At first, it was a legal name on a stack of documents. Then it became something larger. We bought minority positions. We negotiated voting rights. We helped companies refinance debt without demanding our name on their buildings. I learned that ownership looked very different from management. A chief executive had to be seen. An owner only had to understand. Lauren knew Mercer Ridge existed, of course. She saw tax documents. She heard Michael call. She knew I traveled occasionally for investment meetings. But as her career accelerated, she stopped asking for details. I did not force them on her. That was my mistake too. Privacy became habit. Habit became distance. Distance became a story she told herself. Daniel had done well once. Daniel had sold his company. Daniel managed investments now. Daniel preferred staying home. None of those statements were completely false. Together, They created a picture that was. By the time Lauren joined Halcyon Systems, I was already familiar with the company. Years earlier, during a difficult financing period, Mercer Ridge had provided capital when larger funds wanted terms that would have stripped control from management. Later, we increased our position. We did something similar with Westbridge after a downturn in its commercial division. The investments were held through entities designed for long-term ownership, not public attention. My name rarely appeared where journalists looked first. That suited me. It also made it easy for my own wife to miss what was happening. Back in the boardroom, Thomas was answering a question about post-merger governance when Lauren glanced over her shoulder at me. For 1 second, I saw the woman who used to sit on a shipping crate and ask me what I thought would happen next. Then her attention returned to the table. She had not become cruel. That would have been easier to understand. She had simply become certain that she already knew who I was. I looked at the empty chair near the center of the table, the untouched folder, and the silver pen waiting beside it. Then I looked at the woman I had loved for 16 years. The strangest part was not that she did not know why that chair was empty. The strangest part was that she had stopped wondering. Mercer Ridge had never been built for attention. That was the point. After selling the operating company, I discovered something most founders learn too late. Once people know you have money, every conversation changes. Old acquaintances suddenly have opportunities. Strangers have urgent ideas. Executives become unusually friendly. I wanted distance from that noise, so Michael and I built a structure that kept my name away from the spotlight, while keeping my capital close to the decisions that mattered. We started with distressed industrial software companies, then logistics platforms, cybersecurity firms, and infrastructure businesses that larger funds considered too boring to chase. Boring suited me. Boring paid. Boring also gave me time to study balance sheets without cameras waiting outside the building. Mercer Ridge rarely took control in the obvious sense. We did not replace logos or move into corner offices. We negotiated preferred shares, long-term voting agreements, board observer rights, and protective provisions that became important only when a company wanted to sell, issue major debt, or change control. Most people ignored those clauses when times were good. They became very interested when billions of dollars were on the table. Halcyon had come into my life 9 years earlier during a financing crisis that almost never became public. Their products were strong, but a badly timed expansion had left them carrying more debt than their cash flow could comfortably support. Banks tightened terms. 2 private equity firms offered money, but both wanted enough control to reshape the company for a quick exit. Mercer Ridge offered something different. Patient capital. Fewer headlines. More time. In exchange, we received preferred equity and approval rights over any future transaction that would transfer control of the business. The arrangement was not secret. It was simply buried where few people outside legal and finance teams ever bothered to look. Years later, we increased our position after another shareholder needed liquidity. Westbridge came later. Different situation. Same principle. Strong company. Temporary weakness. We provided capital during a market downturn and negotiated similar protections. By the time the 2 companies began discussing a merger, Mercer Ridge held enough economic interest on both sides that no serious banker could structure the transaction without accounting for us. More important, the change of control provisions required our written consent before either company could finalize the deal. That did not mean I could walk into the room and order people around. I never wanted that kind of authority. It meant something quieter. Everyone could negotiate. Everyone could vote. Everyone could celebrate. But until Mercer Ridge approved the final terms, nothing closed. Lauren knew none of that because she had never needed to. Her work at Halcyon was operational and strategic, not ownership. She understood the company structure at the level relevant to her role. Mercer Ridge appeared in documents under investment entities managed through our legal structure. My personal name was not printed across every page. The company had become familiar to her as an institution, not as her husband. I remembered one evening about 3 years earlier when she mentioned Mercer Ridge over dinner. She had been scrolling through emails while I cut into a steak. Some investment group is pushing back on a capital plan, she said. Mercer Ridge. Have you heard of them? I looked up. Yes. She waited maybe half a second. Are they difficult? I almost laughed. Depends who you ask. She smiled at her phone and moved on to another subject. I could have explained everything then. Maybe I should have. Instead, I let the moment pass. At the time, it felt harmless. Sitting in that boardroom, It felt like evidence of how far apart our worlds had drifted while living under the same roof. Andrew Collins continued presenting the financing structure for the merger, a combination of stock, cash, and refinancing. Clean on the screen, complicated underneath. Thomas interrupted twice to emphasize how favorable the terms were. Margaret asked a question about debt covenants. One director from Westbridge wanted clarification about governance after closing. The lawyers answered. Lauren took notes. I watched. At 10:12 a.m., Michael received a message on his phone. He read it once, locked the screen, then moved a blue sheet of paper from one side of his folder to the other. That was our signal. The independent review team had confirmed the updated numbers. I felt the temperature of the room change, even though nobody else could feel it yet. Lauren turned toward me during a short pause. You okay? She whispered. It was the first personal question she had asked me that morning. I am. She glanced at my folder. Still bored. There was a hint of teasing in her voice, almost like the old Lauren. I looked toward the presentation screen where the disputed liability had just been summarized in a footnote small enough to disappear from 20 feet away. Not really. She smiled as if I had made a joke. Then Thomas called the room back to order. If there are no remaining material concerns, he said, I believe we are ready to move toward final approval. Chairs shifted. Pages turned. Pens appeared. Lauren sat straighter. I watched Michael close his folder. For everyone else, the meeting was approaching its finish. For me, it was finally about to begin. Thomas Reed asked for the final voting packets at 10:19 that morning, and the atmosphere in the room shifted from discussion to ceremony. Assistants moved along the walnut table, placing signature pages in front of directors. The investment bankers stopped whispering. Attorneys checked tabs and exhibits one last time. Someone closed the conference room doors. Lauren straightened the papers in front of her and glanced toward the digital clock above the windows. She had spent nearly 2 years getting to this moment, and now the distance between her and everything she wanted could be measured in minutes. Thomas rested both hands on the table. Unless anyone has a material objection, we will proceed with the board approvals. Nobody spoke. Margaret Whitmore looked down the Westbridge side of the table. One director nodded. Another adjusted his glasses and opened the voting packet. Thomas turned toward his own directors. Halcyon first. The corporate secretary began calling names. Each director answered in turn. Yes, yes, yes. The words came calmly, almost mechanically. There was no celebration yet. People in rooms like this knew better than to celebrate before documents were signed. Lauren kept her expression professional, but I could see the tension leaving her shoulders one vote at a time. When the final Halcyon director approved the transaction, Thomas gave a restrained nod. The motion carries. Lauren lowered her eyes for half a second. I knew that gesture. She used to do it whenever something mattered too much to show immediately. Years earlier, when we received the mortgage approval for our first house, she had looked down at the kitchen counter the same way before smiling. I remembered that woman clearly. Then Margaret began the Westbridge vote. Their directors approved the merger with the same measured rhythm. The last vote came from an older man named Robert Caldwell, who had spent most of the morning questioning the financing structure. Approved, he said. Margaret closed her packet. The Westbridge board has authorized the transaction. This time, a few people smiled openly. Andrew Collins leaned back in his chair. One of the bankers quietly exhaled. Thomas looked toward Lauren. Congratulations. Her smile appeared slowly. Thank you. You earned this. Those 3 words landed harder than he probably intended. Lauren had wanted them for years. I could see it in her face. Thomas stood. For a moment, I thought he was about to end the meeting. Instead, Michael Grant cleared his throat. Not loudly. He did not need to. Thomas stopped. Margaret remained seated. The corporate secretary looked toward Michael, then toward the empty chair near the center of the table. The room settled again. Lauren noticed. Is there another document? She asked. Nobody answered immediately. Michael opened his folder and removed a thin set of papers secured with a blue tab. The board approvals are complete, he said. We still require the controlling consent. Lauren looked toward Thomas. I thought legal had cleared all shareholder consents. Thomas did not respond. His expression had changed. Not dramatically, just enough. The smile was gone. Andrew Collins looked down at his notes. Margaret turned her head toward me. That was when Lauren followed her eyes. I was still sitting against the wall, the black folder resting across my knees. Her brow tightened. Daniel, she said quietly. I stood. No announcement. No dramatic gesture. I simply picked up the folder and walked toward the table. The silence followed me. Michael rose and pulled out the empty chair that had been waiting all morning. Nobody questioned it. Nobody asked why. I sat down between representatives from both companies and placed my folder beside the silver pen. Lauren stared at me as if the room had changed shape around her. Thomas finally spoke. His voice was more careful now. Daniel, both boards have approved the negotiated terms. I heard. Lauren looked from him to me. What is happening? Michael slid the blue tab document across the table. Mercer Ridge Holdings possesses approval rights under the change of control agreements covering both transactions. Lauren blinked once. Mercer Ridge. Yes, Michael said. Her eyes returned to me. I could almost see memories connecting behind them. Dinner conversations. Tax documents. Trips she had barely asked about. The investment group she once complained about while checking email. Daniel works with Mercer Ridge, she said, more to herself than anyone else. Michael paused. Daniel does not work with Mercer Ridge. The room became completely still. Lauren's fingers stopped moving over her pen. Michael continued. He controls it. For several seconds, she said nothing. Thomas looked toward the signature packet in front of me. Margaret folded her hands and waited. One by one, the other directors did the same. Lauren turned slowly toward me. There was no embarrassment in her face now, only disbelief. They are waiting for you, she whispered. I looked at the silver pen, then at the numbers still glowing on the presentation screen. Yes, I said. What nobody in that room understood yet was that finally having my attention was not the same thing as having my approval. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The silver pen rested beside the signature packet, perfectly aligned with the edge of the folder, as if the entire morning had been designed to end with one simple motion of my hand. Thomas Reed watched me carefully. Margaret Whitmore did the same. Around the table, directors who had barely acknowledged me an hour earlier were now waiting for me to speak. Lauren was still trying to understand what Michael had just told her. Her eyes moved from the Mercer Ridge documents to me, then back again, searching for some explanation that would make the last several minutes fit the version of my life she had carried into the room. Daniel, she said quietly, why did you never tell me? It was the wrong question for that moment, but I understood why she asked it. I looked at her. We can talk about that later. Her face tightened. Not anger. Confusion. Thomas leaned forward. Daniel, the terms before you reflect nearly 18 months of negotiation. Both boards have approved them unanimously. The financing is committed. Regulatory counsel is comfortable with the structure. We are ready. He spoke respectfully now. The difference in his tone was almost surgical. 2 hours earlier, he had joked that I should enjoy the coffee while everyone else handled the complicated work. Now every word he used around me had been measured twice before leaving his mouth. I opened the folder. Michael had already arranged the documents in the order we had discussed. The first page contained the final consent. The second contained the independent financial review. The third summarized unresolved discrepancies identified during our parallel due diligence process. I read the first line slowly, even though I already knew every word. Thomas mistook my silence for hesitation. If there is a provision you would like clarified, we can have counsel address it immediately. The provisions are clear. Good. He relaxed slightly. I turned the page. The numbers are not. The room went quiet again. Andrew Collins shifted in his chair. Lauren looked at the presentation screen, then back at me. Thomas kept his expression steady. Which numbers? I placed one finger beside the liability reserve. Start here. Andrew answered before Thomas could. That figure reflects the revised exposure estimate provided by the transaction team. I know what it reflects. I looked toward him. I am asking why it is $27 million lower than the independent estimate Mercer Ridge received 3 weeks ago. Andrew stopped. It was not dramatic. His mouth simply closed. One of the Halcyon directors turned toward Thomas. Margaret opened her copy of the financial packet. Lauren began flipping through her notes. 27 million, she asked. That cannot be right. Michael slid a supporting document toward the center of the table. The independent analysis is documented. Thomas reached for it. His eyes moved across the first page. There may be a timing difference. There might be, I said. That is why I asked. I turned another page. Then there is the operating growth assumption. Lauren looked at me immediately. She knew which number I meant. 11.8%. That projection came from the combined modeling team, she said. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the strain underneath it. It is based on customer retention and expansion after integration. What retention rate? She glanced toward Andrew. 94% in the base case. Mercer Ridge received 87. Nobody spoke. Lauren stared at the page in front of her. From whom? Customer concentration review. Completed last Friday. Thomas sat back. Daniel, those differences can be reconciled. Nobody expects every model to match perfectly. Neither do I. I closed the financial review. But I expect material assumptions to be consistent before I approve a transaction of this size. His jaw tightened. Are you suggesting the board postpone closing over modeling differences? No. I looked at him. I am saying I am not signing this today. Lauren inhaled softly beside me. Thomas stared across the table as if he had misheard. Margaret did not react at all. She simply folded her hands and waited. Michael removed the silver pen from beside the packet and placed it back inside his folder. That small sound, metal touching leather, seemed louder than anything else in the room. Thomas spoke first. Daniel, perhaps we should take a short recess and discuss this privately. We will take a recess, I said. But the discussion will not be private. Both boards approved this transaction based on the information presented here. If that information is incomplete, both boards deserve the same explanation. Lauren turned toward me. Her face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. Are you saying someone changed the numbers? I looked at the documents between us. That was the question I had been asking myself for 3 weeks. I am saying the numbers changed, I replied. Now we find out why. Thomas called for a 20-minute recess, but nobody treated it like a break. The investment bankers gathered near the windows without touching the coffee. 2 directors from Westbridge remained seated, quietly comparing pages from Michael's independent review with the numbers in their own packets. Lauren stood beside her chair with one hand resting on the back of it, looking at me as if she wanted to ask 10 questions and did not know which one mattered first. Thomas moved toward Michael. I want every supporting document behind those figures. You will have them, Michael said. Both boards will. Thomas glanced at me. Daniel, this does not need to become larger than it is. I closed my folder. We do not know how large it is yet. He lowered his voice. A $27 million reserve difference inside a transaction of this size is not unusual. Then explaining it should be easy. He held my gaze for a moment before turning away. That was the thing about numbers. People called them complicated when they wanted time, technical when they wanted distance, and immaterial when they wanted you to stop asking questions. I had spent too many years investing other people's jobs and my own money to accept any of those words without evidence. Lauren finally stepped closer. Did you know about these discrepancies before today? Some of them. For how long? 3 weeks. Her expression changed. 3 weeks. The first report came in 3 weeks ago. The customer retention review came Friday. She looked toward Michael, then back at me. And you said nothing to me. You were part of the transaction team. I am your wife. Which is exactly why I could not hand you confidential findings before the review was complete. That answer hurt her. I could see it. But it was true. I had spent years separating our marriage from my investments. Because I believed boundaries protected both. That morning, those same boundaries looked like walls. Lauren folded her arms. Do you think I knew the numbers were different? I do not know. Her eyes sharpened. You do not know? That is what we are here to determine. She looked away toward the Manhattan skyline. I spent 2 years on this. I know. Then you know what stopping it today means. Yes. Do you? Her voice remained quiet, but every word carried weight. People will assume the deal is broken. Employees will hear rumors. The market will react if this leaks. Everything we built toward could disappear. I nodded. And if the assumptions are wrong, closing anyway does not protect any of those people. She had no answer to that. Across the room, Margaret called Michael over. A few minutes later, the directors began returning to their seats. The atmosphere was different now. Earlier, everyone had been preparing to sign. Now they were preparing to question. Thomas resumed his place at the head of the table. We are back in session. Nobody smiled. Michael distributed copies of the independent review. I watched pages move from hand to hand. Blue tabs marked 3 areas. Liability exposure, customer retention, executive compensation. Lauren opened her copy and stopped at the 3rd tab. What is this? She asked. Michael answered. A post-closing compensation schedule that was not included in the board summary circulated last week. Thomas spoke immediately. That schedule is preliminary. Margaret looked up. It awards accelerated compensation to 4 Halcyon executives if specific integration milestones are met. Correct, Thomas said. That is standard retention planning. Robert Caldwell adjusted his glasses. Then why was it not in the materials we approved? Thomas paused. Only for a second, but everyone noticed. Andrew Collins leaned toward his microphone. The compensation schedule was being finalized separately from the merger model. Separately does not mean invisibly, Margaret said. Lauren was still reading. I watched her reach the line that listed the largest potential award. Her eyes stopped. Thomas, read. She looked at him, then at the page again. This package was approved by compensation committee, she asked. Thomas shifted in his chair. It was discussed. Discussed is not approved. No one moved. For the first time that morning, Lauren was no longer defending the transaction. She was examining it. That mattered to me more than whether she understood Mercer Ridge. Michael turned to the next document. There is also a vendor agreement tied to the integration program. $12.4 million over 3 years. Margaret scanned the page. Who owns the vendor? North Coast Advisory, Michael said. Thomas leaned back. A qualified outside consultant. That was not my question, Margaret replied. Michael placed one final sheet on the table. The principal owner is Thomas Reed's brother-in-law. Lauren slowly closed her folder. The room did not explode. It did something more dangerous for a bad deal. It became thoughtful. Directors who had voted yes less than half an hour earlier began rereading everything. Thomas looked toward me. You came here expecting this. I came here hoping your numbers would answer my questions. And now, I looked around the table at both boards. Now I want independent answers. Michael slid a formal resolution toward Margaret and the Halcyon chairman. It called for an immediate review by independent directors, outside counsel, and forensic accountants before any merger consent could be reconsidered. Thomas stared at the document. Lauren did not. She was looking at me, not like a wife discovering her husband's money, not even like an executive watching her promotion move farther away. She looked like someone realizing that the meeting she thought would define her future had just revealed something far more important about the people sitting beside her. I had refused to sign. Now the harder part began, finding out whether the deal could ever deserve my signature. The independent review did not take days to change the room. It took 40 minutes. Michael had arranged for outside counsel and forensic accountants to remain on standby because Mercer Ridge had already identified enough inconsistencies to justify immediate verification. By 11:23 that morning, 2 specialists joined the meeting by secure video conference, and the tone shifted from negotiation to examination. Nobody talked about closing dates anymore. Nobody mentioned celebration. The only question left was whether the numbers everyone had trusted could survive being looked at without assumptions. The first issue was the liability reserve. Westbridge had an unresolved contractual dispute involving a major enterprise customer, and the most recent independent estimate placed potential exposure at $68 million. The merger materials showed $41 million. Robert Caldwell looked at Thomas, who authorized the lower figure. Thomas turned toward Andrew Collins. Andrew opened his notes. The transaction model used management's expected settlement range. Margaret leaned forward. Whose management? Silence stretched across the table. Andrew finally answered. Halcyon's integration team received guidance from senior leadership. Lauren stopped turning pages. My team never approved $41 million, she said. Thomas looked at her. Nobody said you did. Then which senior leadership? He did not answer immediately, and that hesitation told the room more than any speech could have. Michael moved to the customer retention model. The independent review showed that several of Westbridge's largest customers had renewal windows within 12 months of closing. 2 had expressed concerns about service disruption. 1 had already requested revised pricing. The 94% retention assumption presented that morning was technically possible, but it was not supported by the latest customer interviews. The realistic range was closer to 87%. 7 percentage points did not sound dramatic until the accountants translated it into revenue. More than $90 million in projected annual business sat inside that gap. Lauren stared at the calculation. I asked for updated retention data last month. Andrew looked uncomfortable. The model was locked before the interviews were complete. Then why was the old number presented as current? Because it was the approved base case. Lauren's voice became quieter. Approved by whom? Again, nobody answered fast enough. That was when I understood something important. Lauren had not fabricated the numbers. She had not designed the compensation package. She had not hidden the vendor relationship. But she had built her integration plan on information handed down from people she trusted, and somewhere along the way, her desire to complete the merger had become stronger than her instinct to challenge the foundation beneath it. I knew that feeling. Success has a way of turning questions into inconveniences. I had made similar mistakes when I was younger. The difference was that this one involved thousands of employees and billions of dollars in combined value. Michael opened the final section. North Coast Advisory. $12.4 million over 3 years for integration consulting, organizational restructuring, and executive transition services. The contract had been classified as operational support, which meant it had never appeared prominently in the board materials. The owner was Thomas's brother-in-law, Stephen Reed. Thomas spoke before anyone asked. The relationship was disclosed internally. Margaret looked up. To whom? Legal and procurement. Michael shook his head. Outside counsel found no conflict disclosure in the merger data room. Thomas's face hardened. Then, that is an administrative failure. Perhaps, I said. Every head turned toward me. That is why we verify before assigning blame. Thomas looked almost surprised that I had not accused him. I was not interested in accusation. Accusations create noise. Documents create answers. One of the forensic accountants spoke through the conference screen. She explained that North Coast had submitted rates approximately 32% above comparable consulting firms used by Halcyon during the previous 3 years. More troubling, the agreement included a success fee triggered by the merger closing before the end of the quarter. Lauren slowly pushed her chair back an inch. I saw that vendor name, she said. Her voice was barely above normal conversation. It was in an integration memo 6 weeks ago. Thomas turned toward her. Lauren, this is not your responsibility. She ignored him. I asked whether procurement had benchmarked the rates. She looked through her notes, found a page, and stopped. I was told it had already been cleared. I watched her face change as the memory settled in. And I accepted that. There was no excuse in her voice. That mattered. Margaret closed the contract. We all accepted too much. For the first time that morning, the room stopped dividing itself into Halcyon and Westbridge, buyers and sellers, executives and investors. Everyone was looking at the same problem. Thomas folded his arms. So what exactly are you proposing, Daniel? I placed both hands on the table. Independent review of the liability estimate, a fresh customer retention analysis, suspension of the executive compensation package, full conflict review of North Coast Advisory, and no closing until both boards receive corrected materials. That could delay us for weeks. Then it delays us for weeks. The market may punish both companies. The market punishes bad information eventually. I would rather deal with the truth before closing than explain it afterward. Margaret nodded first. Robert followed. Then the Halcyon chairman asked Michael to draft the resolution. Lauren said nothing. She was staring at her own notes. One page marked with a question she had asked 6 weeks earlier and never followed up on. I could see the realization settling over her. The most dangerous thing in that room was not a hidden number. It was what happened when ambitious people stopped asking why.